project and has finished earlier than anyone in the history of the honors program.
It's not a merit, it's mostly I just wanted to have it over with. Thank you all so much for coming today. It really does mean a lot to me. Before I begin talking about my topic, I have 3 very specific thank yous that I need to make, and so Grace is going to help me with that. First, Ron and Cindy Blevins, we all wave. They adopted me as a freshman and have been my Texas parents and made possible, sorry, there's only one bouquet of flowers, Ron, but they've made possible just my thriving, not just surviving while at college. And then the other 2 are to my mom, wave please, and my second mom who I'm named after, Kay Craig, because this is the second time that they have driven 16 and a half hours to come see me at college, and they have faithfully prayed for me, supported me, challenged me, and inspired me countless ways my entire life. College, especially so far away from home, and especially last year, would have been an impossibility without them. My world had kind of fallen apart, and they both faithfully pointed me back to the truth and to the Lord. And I probably wouldn't be as healthy and as here as I am without both my mom and Kay, and I definitely wouldn't have completed this on the time frame that I did without them. So all those people, would you please just give them a hand? So, now for the fun to begin. So my capstone is on business as a mission, asset-based community development. For clarity's sake, asset-based community development is going to be ABCD for the rest of this presentation. So this is my personal purpose statement. I started writing this capstone and it could have gone off into a million different directions. I sat down and started writing the paper, and I had to organize it under headings because I just thought, well, I want to talk about this and I want to talk about this. And so I had to write this just to keep my focus. And so I don't believe that there's a spiritual secular divide when it comes to vocation and calling. I think anything done unto the glory of God is holy and is for His kingdom. So this capstone was birthed from a desire to do ministry well. And living in Brazil, South America for 3 months, I volunteered as a TA at an international school. I observed a model of ministry that was both effective and sustainable. It was highly, highly impressive as a ministry model and also as a business model. And when done correctly, it can maximize results and minimize negative impacts. In researching for this capstone, one of my favorite parts was finding all the different either whole or partial models around the world that function. There's no one size fits all, which makes it not really a definition, but almost like a set of principles. And sometimes we tend to perceive something like a school that isn't directly linked to the church as something secular. And so my hope is to inspire a shift in perception of what missions and ministry can look like. To be human is to live in a relationship with God and others, one aspect of being human. And ministry done well is rooted in healthy relationships through discipleship. And this combats 4 areas of poverty, not just one like we often think. The 4 poverties that we're going to go into are poverty of spiritual intimacy, poverty of being, poverty of community, and poverty of stewardship. To be human is to have needs, and those needs have to be met, or can be met, in healthy, sustainable ways. Meeting people's needs through ministry involves transformational relationships and not just pre-programmed operations. It can't be about a quick fix, a band-aid, a simple service day. It has to be about a long-term healing solution. Living as if the kingdom of God has come, is coming, and is yet to come takes a lot of intentionality. The church can be faithful to work, to be stewards of the resources that we're given, while completely aware of our dependency upon God. And so my personal journey with business as a mission began unbeknown to me when I was 15. In the summer of 2013, I had the incredible opportunity to live with a host family in Carpina, Brazil for 3 months and serve as a TA at an international school, and this is where this idea was first introduced to me. So these are my kids from my classroom. That's Sophia right there, and Melissa, and João, and Melody, no, that's Eriki, that's Joelle, and Melody and Sophia, and she was sassy. I would say something to her in English and she'd argue with me in Portuguese, but it was accurate because she understood both languages and she was 2.5. And I was like, girl. So this wasn't just any English school though. Missionary pastor and businessman Telemaco Moraes recognized multiple needs in his region. He saw that he had young pastors wanting to plant churches in rural Brazil. Now these areas were very poverty-stricken, and so they couldn't really financially support a pastor and his family on any type of salary. Telly also realized that he had an entire group of Brazilians who were wealthy financially who were not hearing the gospel message because they had such structured lives. You know, they're not going to go to sport outreach or to street evangelism or anything like that. They don't need any free meals, you know, the typical ways that we think of going and doing ministry. And so Telly was like, well, if we open an English school, the children who their parents want them to learn English will, you know, they pay tuition for them to go to a very quality school. I was like the most unqualified TA there. I was like, you know, teaching at the preschool level. But the tuition money, these kids paid to go to school, and they were hearing the gospel message at school. That was the only place they were hearing it. They weren't going to church. And then they were also able to train and employ a lot of the pastors' wives to be TAs and cafeteria workers and things like that. Then they were pulling a check from the school, and they were still able to plant churches in rural Brazil. And I thought, why don't we try to make our projects more self-sustainable, something that actually can support itself to some extent. I thought it was incredibly ingenious, and it really did shock me when one of the teachers was like, well, you know, Molly, some people don't see the school as a ministry at all because it's not a church. And I was like, no way! This is so, such a good idea. And so I really wanted to kind of change that perception of this spiritual secular, that the school was secular and the church was spiritual, because I think that's a misconception. And so modern culture has kind of these are my siblings. So this is Wyatt, Gavin, and Abigail. They posed for me very nicely. But we have this, actually I think my mom took that picture, but we have this perception that some vocations are holy. If you are a pastor or a missionary, then you're doing, you know, Jesus work. While if you're a doctor or a teacher or a surgeon or a therapist or a welder or a utility worker or a construction engineer, then you have this secular worldly vocation. And I was like, that doesn't make any sense to me. And so ABCD views anything done for God's glory and for his kingdom as holy. And it considers a calling to be a vocation based on gifting. The method proposed to implement this vision is the asset-based community development, and it helps bridge the gap between the spiritual and secular realms through business as a mission. ABCD manifests itself beautifully all over the world in a lot of different models that we're going to get to go into it. It's, you know, the English school that is sharing the gospel with their students, and it's an agricultural company teaching sustainable farming, and it's a missionary couple helping villages repair and maintenance freshwater wells, and it's the operation of a boutique that serves as a counseling program for survivors of human trafficking. These are businesses being run with a kingdom focus that encompasses all vocations, and it seeks to combat poverty holistically and sustainably. This emerging view is helping to combat like a one-dimensional view of humanity. So this is my one-dimensional man. I probably should have let Cameron draw it, but I wanted to use my artwork. But kind of we started to view people as flat. We like ironed them out into one dimension. Sometimes as the church we'll make people purely spiritual beings. Like all you need is Jesus and that's it. It's kind of like, yes, but no, you know, you need more than, and sometimes we make people purely physical beings. And where again, nothing else matters, just like food, shelter, like, you know, you're surviving. But it's kind of like, no, people are so much more complex and multifaceted than that. We are definitely not one-dimensional. And when we seek to alleviate poverty only using a one-dimensional approach, it doesn't ever solve the whole problem. And that's kind of what we're facing right now. For instance, no one disagrees that global poverty is an issue. We don't always approach it in the correct way, though, because we have a very materialistic, one-dimensional definition of poverty. So when we think of poverty, we think of dilapidation, physical dilapidation. This is from my trip to Mexico in 2014. The enormity of physical poverty creates a very bleak picture. In Africa, childbirth is the leading cause of death in adolescent girls. 6 million children die from malnutrition before their 5th birthday around the world. FINCA is the Foundation for International Community Assistance, and they say that 40 million children worldwide live without adequate shelter. You know, I think we've all heard the statistics on how many people live on less than $2.50 a day or less than $1.25 a day. Clean water, very, very significant problem. You know, 2.6 billion people lack basic sanitation. Of the World Health Organization reporting on the nearly 16,000 deaths every day says that 83% of these deaths are caused by what, when we're looking at them, are completely preventable if they had basic sanitation, basic nutrition, basic health care, things like that. But poverty is overwhelmingly a significant underlying cause of preventable death, albeit manifested in different ways. Many factors contribute to poverty, including corruption, joblessness, economic instability, abuse, and isolation. But if we're going to alleviate the suffering caused by poverty, we have to first seek to identify the root causes of the symptoms displayed. We haven't always been very good at this. So we're going to talk about both of these people. Because of our materialistic definition of poverty, most of our alleviation attempts have been monetary handouts in the form of aid. However, when free aid is given long term, it doesn't ultimately lift individuals, communities, or countries out of poverty. If perpetual aid were the answer, the results would show staggering success after decades of aid that have been poured in an attempt, a genuine attempt to heal and restore. The actual observed results of long-term aid, however, are less than encouraging. So this is Rwandan President Paul Kagame, and this is Dr. Dembisa Moyo. And so both these people are prominent leaders, and they have interesting things to say about this. Rwandan President Paul Kagame explains, while more than 300 billion US dollars in aid has apparently been dispersed in our continent since 1970, there is little to show for it in terms of economic growth and human development. Dembisa Moyo has her PhD in economics from Oxford, and then previously she'd gotten her master's from Harvard, and she wrote, "It is these billions of dollars of aid that have hampered, stifled, and retarded Africa's development. Africa's real per capita income today is lower than in the 1970s, leaving many African countries at least as poor as they were 40 years ago." When poverty is combated with purely subsidization, the results are often unintentionally the exact opposite of the goal. Now, no aid or help is ever given with malicious intent, and so it makes it a sticky issue to navigate. Every donor has the best of intentions, but in some cases, donors have actually done more harm than good when following this typical model. Mariam Madeni tells a compelling parable about what doing missions with Westerners is like for the rest of the world. It's called The Elephant and the Mouse. I'm going to read it to you. Again, please notice my lovely artwork. It's not, but we won't forget. So, the story goes like this. Elephant and Mouse were best friends. One day, Elephant said, "Mouse, let's have a party." Animals gathered from far and near. They ate, they drank, they sang, and they danced. And no one celebrated more and danced harder than Elephant. After the party was over, Elephant exclaimed, "Mouse, did you ever go to a better party? What a blast." But Mouse did not answer. "Mouse, where are you?" Elephant called. He looked around for his friend and then shrank back in horror. There at Elephant's feet lay Mouse. His little body was ground into the dirt. He had been smashed by the big feet of his exuberant friend Elephant. Sometimes that is what it's like doing missions with you Americans, the African storyteller commented. It is like dancing with an elephant. And while the narrative sounds harsh, it has sometimes been reality. One only has to ask a full-time missionary, and I've interviewed several, to know some of the accuracy of the parable. Sometimes short-term mission trips cause more work for the hosting missionaries than help provided. Lack of skill, experience, and work ethic can actually incur damage instead of alleviate need. Dembiza Moyo paints a vivid illustration of the damage that is sometimes done. She tells this story. Suppose a local mosquito net manufacturer employs 10 people, who each support 15 dependents. It's 150 people. Mosquito nets used as protection from malaria are not being produced fast enough to meet needs, and so an organization steps in with a quick solution. They collect mosquito nets and distribute them to the community's poor at no cost. Consequently, the manufacturer is put completely out of business, and now his family, his dependents, his 10 employees, and their 15 dependents each are also jobless and spiraling down into abject poverty. The well-intentioned efforts to alleviate poverty come from strong roots of generosity and social morality, but unfortunately sometimes have the opposite effect. This is called relief. And relief is the quickest and easiest way to help anyone who's suffering. But a principle that we need to guide us is that relief should only be used in emergency situations, as it stems from a completely one-dimensional physical definition of poverty. It's the type of help that is most frequently engaged in because it's easier to raise donor money for relief than for development. It's kind of like you don't want a headless heart and then you don't want a heartless head. You gotta, go for a balance. Pulling efforts out completely is also a damaging decision. In James it talks about man is not only accountable for the wrong that he does, but also the good that he sees he ought to do and intentionally does not do it. Therefore, sitting idly by while others suffer is not a morally viable option. The solution is not to say, well, enough damage done, hands off, but instead to seek to understand how to actually help in a healthy, sustainable, biblical way. And this is where ABCD comes in. So here's a picture from my time in Brazil as well. We were doing a basketball clinic. For those of you who know me, I didn't do anything with basketball. I took pictures. Any significant attempt at alleviating poverty needs to be started with moral and ethical standards, an awareness of a holistic person, and a long-term goal of sustainable transformation. Paramount to finding a solution to poverty is properly defining it. Like I said, we've largely defined it in physical terms. But what's interesting is those actually living in poverty, West or otherwise, seem to suffer. They do suffer from the physical deprivation, but they also suffer a lot more from emotional and psychological deficiencies that poverty inflicts. It's not just about a house, food, and clothes, but also about dignity, value, meaningfulness, and worth. In When Helping Hurts, Corbett and Fickert, I based a lot of my research on that, is When Helping Hurts, Corbett and Fickert define poverty using 4 smaller poverties. It's not just one thing. So these are the 4 poverties, and they afflict mankind today. And operating from this definition of poverty can lend itself to creating a more holistic and sustainable solution. Corbett and Fickert say, defining poverty is not an academic exercise, for the way that we define it, either implicitly or explicitly, plays a major role in determining the solutions we use in our attempts to alleviate it. So what we think it is impacts how we're going to try to solve it. It's much more than physical deprivation. They say it's an absence of shalom in all of its meanings. Poverty is a multifaceted issue, and it requires a multifaceted solution. We need to have a model that addresses all 4 aspects, not just one. So we're going to look at each one individually. Poverty is spiritual into me. This is Enchanted Rock. I was actually really happy on this day. It doesn't as sad as it might need to appear for the topic. But this poverty is the one the church is extremely familiar with. It's a lack of relationship with the Lord. The results or symptoms of this type of poverty are just kind of like maybe an ignorance or oblivion to God's presence and involvement. It can manifest itself in materialism or idolization of gifts over the giver. It can result in worship of false gods or idols, and just a lot of spiritual bondage. So that type of poverty found all over the world. The second type of poverty is poverty of being. So this one's fun. This is after my sister and I beat my parents at pool, which was a great day for us. I think this type of poverty is especially prevalent. So basically, this type of poverty is the oscillation that we see between this absolutely no self-efficacy, like they're like, I'm worthless, I'm not worth anything, to like this God complex when people think like, I'm all that plus tax, like this is so great. So obviously in this moment, Samantha and I represent the God complex, and my parents the zero self-efficacy. The only reason that was fun is because they always beat us, and so that was the one time that they didn't. But there's poverty of community. Y'all have heard the expression like, we can get through anything as long as we're together. Viktor Frankl talks about the idea that if you have a why to live, you will find out a how, But if you don't have a why, it doesn't really matter anymore. And so the idea that when you're suffering from poverty of community, it's just lonely is a really easy way to say it. It's selfishness and isolation, contributors and exasperators of depression, anxiety, and loneliness. Sometimes our reason why isn't a person or people, but often it is. It can be something else that's positive, but it's when it's lacking, nothing can really make up for purposelessness. And this is also a poverty that a lot of people are suffering from. So those are my host sisters, actually from Brazil. That's my hand, and then Jessica, Stephanie, and Rebecca. And then there's poverty of stewardship. So this is what we also think of. This is what we typically think of when we think of poverty. Poverty of stewardship results in a loss in sense of purpose and identity. It can either cause a completely lazy attitude or a completely workaholic attitude. It can result in materialism or complete deprivation. It's just as damaging as the others. It's important to note that all of these are interconnected. Often people suffer from more than one form of poverty. Some are more obvious than others. When you're using an ABCD model, you seek to identify the assets and needs in a case-by-case basis and acknowledge all the areas of the poverty, acknowledging the complexity of the problem. So this is where development comes in. So we talked about relief, and that's the really quick, easy way to do it. But development is harder, but it's a lot more worth it in the end. So it's about supplying, equipping, and empowering. And yes, Wyatt and I found this stat on the wall, and we hung the thing up ourselves. So great. This is the long-term freedom-giving solution to poverty. Corbett and Fickert expound development is a lifelong process. It's not a 2-week product. We all live in I'm sure everyone's heard that. We live in a microwave culture, but really some things take a crock pot. That's kind of what this is. Valuing process over product requires an intentional perspective change on what success looks like. It also means that short-term mission trips function more as an educational aspect of missions and ministry, and should be a lot more focused on serving the career missionaries who are on the field. Because it takes longer than 7 days, 10 days, or 2 weeks to actually do something long-term of value, but yet having people willing to come learn, see, and support a long-term mission or ministry being implemented can be a blessing when done correctly. So when a career missionary decides to engage in asset-based community development, they ask the community in question what the people living there would like to see improved. They look for the assets and resources that are already in the community. If a community is on the complete receiving end of developmental efforts, there's problems. What's often missed are the assets and resources already there. What we look for is likely what we will see. If a nonprofit organization goes in just looking for problems, looking for the negative, looking for everything wrong, and again, this is what they from the outside think is wrong, that is what they're going to see, and it's not going to go well. But if they go in and look for strengths to build off of, they ask questions, and they focus on building relationships, they're often surprised and elated by what can be found there. By building off of the community's assets, organizations can equip and encourage communities on their path to self-sufficiency. Equipping rather than enabling gives dignity, hope, and long-term alleviation. This doesn't just apply to physical needs, but also mental, emotional, social, and spiritual needs. There's no one-size-fits-all, and so much ABCD is done from a set of principles. So there's two kind of like sets of principles. So these are like the 4 keys to ABCD. We're not going to like talk about these for super long, but y'all can read them. And it's just the idea of really going and seeing like what's here, what help does someone actually want? You know, because sometimes you don't want help with something, and you have to also understand that like maybe there's not a lot of physical need, but there's a lot of, you know, poverty of community or poverty of being. And so then you got to shift your focus on how you're going to even formulate something to alleviate or address it. So these are super helpful when you're seeking to do asset-based community development, because again, there's no one-size-fits-all. There's no one really simple definition, which makes it like kind of hard, but also like pretty cool. It's just like people aren't Excel spreadsheets, you know? And sometimes that can be overwhelming. Most of the time that's pretty neat. And then also, Robert Lupton wrote a book called Toxic Charity. And he has what he calls his Oath for Compassionate Service, which I think, if applied, would be, when it is applied, it is incredible. So you don't do for others what they have the capacity to do for themselves. I mean, that works across the board. And a lot of, sometimes what we do is aid or charity violates that first principle immediately. So for example, local church is wants to build a building in an impoverished community, and they need to paint it. So the typical approach is to bring in a team of 20 high school students with no painting experience. They have no idea the local language or customs, and they each pay or raise upwards of $2,000 in order to go. The team paints the church, sees the ministry, and flies home. $200,000 has been spent on an educational trip, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it has crippled the local economy and moral initiative by bringing in volunteers, which cost more than like their worth in labor. An ABCD approach would say, take $200,000, and there's a couple things you can do. First one, hire local community members to paint the church. This reduces local unemployment, it gives valuable job training, and it boosts the local economy from abject poverty. Another approach, if you're still wanting to partner with churches, is to bring in a team of, say, high schoolers who perhaps paid for their educational trip themselves, and they get to work alongside locals and learn from their experience. Another way would be to bring in several expert painters, you know, from a congregation, if that's their vocation, come teach professional skills to the local workers, thus allowing for increased job opportunity. In researching for this capstone, one of the most exciting things was discovering all of these ABCD models already in existence all over the world. So we get to talk about 4 of them today, which I'm super excited about. So this is Adler Stewart's. This slide was blank up until like 24 hours ago, and I was like, oh no, I forgot to get the pictures from Pete, because my friend went to Kenya over spring break with Adler Stewart's, and I knew that I wanted to talk about this. So Adler Stewart's is an organization actually based out of northern Indiana, headquartered at Purdue University, and they teach sustainable farming all over the world. I get their email updates. I just got one from Cuba, and these pictures are from Kenya. So actually, that's Pete there in the white ball cap. So he went and they got to, you know, work with teaching sustainable agricultural and farming. They really are making a huge difference. And then they also, while they were there, did some music ministry, church ministry, VBS ministry, things like that. I didn't get like a full report, but he said it was great. And so I think Adler Stewart's is approaching this well. They're giving them the tools to be self-sustaining. They're giving them the tools to feed themselves and their families, and that's really neat. And they're also doing it in such a way that addresses dignity and hope, you know, not just food. And so Another one is right here in Abilene. This is DRI. I love them. Have you all ever been out to the Pumpkin Patch fundraiser? Who's been to the Pumpkin Patch fundraiser? Yeah. So that's what that's from. We had a lot of fun. And then Michelle and I actually found the salsa. This is at Market Street one day. We got really excited. We talked to the lady for a long time. And at the end, she's like, here's my phone number. Like, if you need any information. I was like, thank you. But DRI is really cool. They employ adults with mental disabilities, and it's a ministry on one hand and a business on the other. Making salsa and giving dignity through job creation is the kind of social justice that lines up with biblical standards, and it's really cool. This is from Uganda. So this is Global Belief Project. I love this story. Behind this, there's a couple. Their name was Jake and Taylor Radovich, and they were educated and experienced in working in the water treatment industry. They were living in California, I think, and they became Christians, and they wanted to use their expertise for the kingdom of God. They were like, oh, I know what we want to do. We want to dig freshwater wells, because fresh water is a big deal. So they traveled to Uganda to evaluate the water crisis, but they found something really interesting and not what they were expecting. They encountered a freshwater well approximately every 10 kilometers, and the Radovich realized that access to fresh water was not the current problem. Maintenance by village participation was. The wells were there, but they were all broken and unusable. What had happened was that a church would come in, following the traditional short-term mission model, stay for a week, build a well, and leave. After a time, the mechanics of the well broke down, and the village was left without a way to repair or maintenance it, and the village would go back to using dirty groundwater. The Radoviches now live in Uganda, and they repair approximately one well per week. Their model, however, is all about equipping local village members in the use, maintenance, and repair of the well. They went in and they looked for the assets already in the community: manpower, work ethic, intelligence, competence, and then they helped equip those members in such a way to develop a long-term sustainable solution to the problem of polluted water. Now, Global Belief Project also does a really great job at partnering with churches in a really healthy way. So this is pictures from last summer. I got these from my friend Jocelyn. So this is Jocelyn, and she went to Uganda this summer with my church back in India. So there's Gunnar and Cameron and Jocelyn's right there, and I think Esther's in there somewhere. Mm-hmm. So this is like very close to my heart too. And they went and they helped repair. So they allowed teams of students to raise money for the well repairs and for their trip, and the students then travel to Uganda and they work alongside village members in the construction and learn from them. And that's a really healthy way to do education that doesn't do further damage. So a fourth example, this is the last one, is the Hope Center Boutique in Indianapolis. So my grandma bought the dress for me, I didn't buy the t-shirt, but this is really cool. It's a business called the Hope Center Boutique, and it's unique in that profit from the business goes directly to support a sex trafficking restoration ministry. Survivors of sex trafficking are housed, clothed, fed, and offered counseling services and job training. None of this is free, but it can be paid for in a sustainable way. The founders of this business looked at their community and evaluated the assets. Their assets included a building in a central location, a local church community full of ready volunteers and donations, and they're like, in a community of women who like to shop, okay, we're gonna open this. They opened a boutique that receives donations, they sell them at a decent price, and the revenue brought in supports the restoration of those rescued from human trafficking. It's really cool. So, job creation is a very interesting form, a very biblical form of social justice. This was from the BAM conference in Dallas in September. Michelle and I got to go. And I really loved what Mats Thunhag had to say. He said, the root cause, he was using human trafficking as an example, there's many other examples you can use, is unemployment, and I would also say greed. We need to answer the question, out of trafficking and into what? Jobs. And who are creating jobs? Business people. When done correctly and informed by the principles of Christ and of generosity and fairness, a business can offer a lot of keys to freedom because, yes, we need rescue. And then after rescue, you need a long-term sustainable solution. And so when I was in middle school, I had a pastor that told a whole group of us, we have enough doctors and lawyers. Consider a life given to the gospel. The second part of this is an excellent challenge. Consider a life given to the gospel. But the first part of it is a gross misconception of what ministry is. This world needs businessmen, doctors, lawyers, energy workers, construction engineers, architects, teachers, professors, therapists, who love the Lord and are willing to love others well in their sphere of influence, just as much as it needs pastors and missionaries to work full-time in the church. I personally have encountered this as a business major. So, I promise it's not you, Caitlin. I currently work as the undergraduate freshman women's chaplain. I get asked what my major is and what I study, and I tell people my life's a mess. I'm a business administration major with a psychology minor, and I just got hired at a church. And they give me this look that says, only Bible majors can be chaplains, right? And I'm like, no, everything is ministry. Each job and task, when done unto the glory of God, is holy. I love C.S. Lewis' explanation of this. It says, the application of Christian principles to trade unionism or education must come from Christian trade unionists and Christian schoolmasters, or therapists, or doctors, or lawyers, or welders. Just as Christian literature comes from Christian novelists and dramatists, not from the bench of bishops getting together, trying to write plays and all this. Oh. So, this is also from the BAM conference, the Business as a Mission. Missionary, vocation is a calling, and missionary is a calling for each believer in whatever field of influence they operate in. My dad has worked for the same natural gas utility since he was 17 years old, and I would say his job is just as much of a ministry as being a pastor. He has prayed with people, and he's often